In the spring of 1987, every farmer in Pottawatomie County, Iowa, planted corn the same way. This was not a decision. It was gravity. Corn was what western Iowa did the way the Missouri River ran east. Not because anyone chose it, but because nobody could imagine anything else. The soil was black and deep, and it had been growing corn since before the county had a name, and the men who worked it were the sons of men who had worked it, and their fathers before them, and the idea that any of them might do something different with that ground was not a controversial idea. It was not even an idea. It was simply not a thing that existed. The Halverson farm sat on 400 acres just south of the Mosquito Creek watershed, and it had been in the family since 1921. Harold Halverson had bought the original 160 acres from a neighbor who was leaving for factory work in Omaha, and he had added to it piece by piece through the 30s and 40s until it was a real farm, a serious farm, the kind of farm that meant something in a county where farms meant everything. Harold's son, Dale, had taken it over in 1962 and had run it the same way his father had: corn in the spring, soybeans in rotation, and hydrous ammonia in the fall, repeat. Dale was not an unthinking man. He was a careful man, a methodical man, a man who kept records in a green ledger book and knew his per-acre yields going back 20 years. He had good land, and he worked it well, and he produced good corn, and he sold it at the elevator in Minden, and he paid his bills, and he went to church on Sunday, and he did not ask whether there was another way to do things, because the way he was doing things was working. His daughter, Claire, was 18 years old in the spring of 1987, and she had just finished her first year at Iowa State University in Ames. Let me tell you about Claire Halverson, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from every character this channel has ever told you about. Not because she was smarter than her father, though she was quick. Not because she was braver, though she turned out to be. She was different because she came back from Ames with a notebook. Not a green ledger book like her father's, a spiral-bound college notebook, the kind with the black and white speckled cover, filled front to back with lecture notes and photocopied research papers, and the kind of handwritten marginalia that only appears when someone is genuinely excited by what they are reading. Claire had spent her first year in the agronomy program at Iowa State, and she had taken an introductory soils course taught by a professor named Dr. Raymond Voss, and Dr. Voss had spent 12 weeks telling his students something that most of western Iowa had never heard and would not have believed if they had. He told them that the soil itself was alive, not metaphorically alive, literally, biologically alive, a system of organisms and relationships and chemical processes so complex that the fertilizer inputs most farmers were using were not so much feeding the soil as they were substituting for it, bypassing it, slowly, year by year, making it dependent on the inputs and less capable of doing what soil was supposed to do on its own. Claire had written that down. She had underlined it twice. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand what Claire understood before you can understand what she proposed. Healthy, agricultural soil contains somewhere between 100 million and 1 billion individual microorganisms per teaspoon. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, a living web of organisms that decompose organic matter, fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, break down minerals into plant-available nutrients, and build the physical structure of the soil itself. The key to that structure, the thing that makes soil hold water instead of shedding it, breathe instead of compacting, feed plants through drought instead of failing them, is organic matter. Specifically, it is the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio of that organic matter and the mycorrhizal fungi that connect plant roots to the broader soil network the way a nervous system connects organs to a brain. Continuous corn, planted in the same fields year after year, fed with synthetic nitrogen and plowed in the fall, was doing something specific to that system. It was reducing organic matter. It was disrupting the fungal networks. It was compacting the subsoil with heavy equipment passes and eliminating the biological activity that kept that compaction from becoming permanent. Dale Halverson's fields were producing 140 bushels per acre, which was good for 1987. But Dr. Voss had shown his students data from long-term trials at the university's research farm, suggesting that those same fields, managed differently, could sustain 160 to 180 bushels without increasing inputs, or produce 120 bushels with dramatically reduced inputs and dramatically improved drought resilience. The difference was organic matter. The difference was biological activity. The difference, in one of the trials Dr. Voss had referenced from a research station in Nebraska, was a cover crop of red clover interseeded between the corn rows in late spring, left to grow through the fall, winter killed, and incorporated into the soil the following spring as green manure. Red clover, between the corn rows, in a corn county. Claire drove home from Ames in May with her notebook on the passenger seat and a bag of red clover seed in the trunk that she had bought from the university extension office for $14. She brought it up at dinner on a Tuesday night. She waited until her father had finished eating, because she had learned over 18 years that Dale Halverson was a more patient man on a full stomach, and she laid the notebook open on the table next to his coffee cup, and she said, "I want to try something on the back 40. Dale looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter. He said, "What kind of something?" She explained it the way Dr. Voss had explained it to her. The soil biology, the organic matter, the mycorrhizal networks, the nitrogen fixation. She told him about the Nebraska trial data. She told him about the water holding capacity numbers. She told him that red clover interseeded at the V4 corn stage, after the canopy was established, would not compete with the corn for light or moisture during the growing season, and would fix 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre that would be available to the following year's crop. She told him that the per-acre seed cost was 35 cents. The kitchen went quiet. Her mother, Ruth, stopped washing the dishes. Dale set down his coffee cup and looked at the notebook for a long time without saying anything. "You want to plant clover in the corn," he said finally, "between the rows, after V4. In a cornfield. Yes." Dale picked up his coffee cup again. "I'll think about it," he said. Ruth dried her hands on the dish towel and walked past Claire on the way to the living room and said quietly, so only Claire could hear, "She's right, you know. I've been watching what the Hendersons do with their pasture ground. The grass comes back thicker every year where they've got clover in it." Dale thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he told Claire she could plant her clover on the back 40, not the whole farm, the back 40, which was the least productive ground they had, low-lying, prone to compaction, the field that had never quite responded to inputs the way the rest of the farm did. "If it makes a mess of the corn," he said, "we don't do it again." Claire said that was fair. Let me tell you about what happened at the Pottawatomie County Co-op the following Saturday, because it is the moment this story turns, and you need to understand the room before you can understand what was said in it. The co-op, on a Saturday morning in May, was a specific kind of place. It was the place where the serious farmers of Pottawatomie County gathered before the day's work, and they drank bad coffee from a machine near the seed display, and they talked about prices and weather and equipment, and the man who held court in that room most Saturday mornings was a fellow named Gerald Stokes. Gerald Stokes was the pioneer hybrid seed dealer for most of western Iowa, and he had been selling seed corn in Pottawatomie County since 1971, and he knew every farmer in the room by name and by acreage and by yield history, and he had an opinion about everything that happened on every farm in his territory. He was not a bad man. He was a confident man, a successful man, a man who had built his business on the certainty that he understood what farmers needed and that what they needed was the product he was selling. He was 53 years old, and he had never been wrong about corn in Pottawatomie County, and he had the sales figures to prove it. Claire had stopped at the co-op to pick up a parts order for her father. She was not there to make an announcement, but Gerald Stokes was behind the counter when she came in, and he saw the clover seed bag in her truck bed through the window, and he said, loud enough for the 6 or 7 farmers in the room to hear, "Claire Halverson, what in the world have you got in the back of that truck?" She told him. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gerald Stokes started laughing. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever heard someone laugh at an idea they haven't actually thought about? Not a laugh of genuine amusement, not a laugh of surprise, but a laugh that is a reflex, the sound a person makes when something challenges a certainty they have never examined, and the only tool they have for dealing with that challenge is to make the challenger feel small? That was the laugh Gerald Stokes produced in the Pottawatomie County Co-op on that Saturday morning in May of 1987. It was a short laugh, a dismissive laugh, a laugh that assumed the room would join it, and some of the men in the room did, and some of them just looked at their coffee cups. "Clover," Gerald said, wiping his eye. "You're going to plant clover in Dale Halverson's corn. Honey, this isn't a pasture. This is a corn operation. You can't just seed down a hay crop in the middle of a cornfield." Claire said, "It's not a hay crop. It's a cover crop. It'll fix nitrogen and build organic matter for next year's rotation." "Your daddy know about this?" "He gave me the back 40. Gerald shook his head like a man watching someone make a mistake he had seen before. "The back 40, he said. "All right. Well, when it doesn't work, at least it's only 40 acres. He looked at the room and said, "Iowa State, teaching kids to grow hay in corn country." And a couple of the men laughed again, and Gerald went back to his paperwork. Claire picked up her parts order and walked out. She did not say anything else. She did not argue. She got in the truck and drove home, and she planted her clover. Let me tell you about the planting, because the details matter. Claire interseeded the red clover at the V4 stage of corn development, which is when the corn plant has 4 fully emerged leaf collars and the canopy is beginning to close. She used a cyclone seeder mounted on an ATV, broadcasting at 8 pounds per acre across all 40 acres of the backfield in a single afternoon in late June. The clover germinated within 10 days. By August, when the corn was at full canopy and the clover was growing in the shade beneath it, you could walk the rows and see the small trifoliate leaves spreading across the soil surface between the stalks. A green carpet under the corn, quiet and unremarkable, doing nothing that anyone standing in the field could see. That was the thing about what Claire was doing. It was invisible. The biology she was trying to restore was happening underground, in the top 6 inches of soil, in a world of organisms too small to see and processes too slow to observe. Gerald Stokes and every other farmer driving past on the county road could look at that back 40 and see nothing unusual. Just corn. The clover was there if you got out and walked the rows, but from the road it looked exactly like every other cornfield in the county. The corn came off in October at 138 bushels per acre on the clover field. Dale's best ground had done 144. The back 40 had averaged 122 the year before, so 138 was an improvement, but it was not a dramatic one. Claire recorded it in her notebook. She noted the clover stand going into winter. Dense and healthy, she wrote, good ground cover. She noted the date of the first hard frost, which winter killed the clover and left a mat of organic residue across the soil surface. Gerald Stokes heard the yield number from someone at the elevator and said, to no one in particular, that 138 bushels on ground that had done 122 was probably just a good year, not a clover year. Dale did not say anything about expanding the trial, but he did not tell her to stop. Let me tell you about the spring of 1988, because that is when the numbers started to matter. Claire came back from Ames for the summer with more research. A study from the University of Minnesota on legume nitrogen credits in corn rotations, a paper from the Rodale Institute on organic matter accumulation under cover crop systems, and a set of soil test results she had arranged through the Extension office that spring before planting. The back 40 had tested at 3.1% organic matter the previous fall. The rest of the farm averaged 2.7%. That difference, Dr. Voss had told his class, was the difference between soil that held water through a dry July and soil that started showing stress by the 20th. It was the difference between a crop that fed itself and a crop that needed you to feed it. She told Dale about the soil tests at dinner. He looked at the numbers for a long time. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. But the direction is right. He thought about it. Then he said, you can do the back 80. The back 80. She had doubled her trial. She planted clover again in late June, same method, same rate. She also began keeping a water infiltration log, a simple measurement, a coffee can pushed into the soil with a measured amount of water poured in, timing how long it took to absorb. The back 40, after 1 year of clover, absorbed water at a rate of 2.3 inches per hour. The adjacent corn ground, no cover crop, absorbed water at 0.9 inches per hour. She wrote that number down and underlined it 3 times. The 1988 harvest came in at 141 bushels per acre on the clover ground. The rest of the farm did 136. The gap was narrowing in the wrong direction for Gerald Stokes's argument, but it was still close enough that he could have called it noise. What was not noise was the anhydrous ammonia application. Dale had always applied 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre as anhydrous in the fall. Claire had convinced him to reduce the application on the back 80 to 100 pounds, crediting the clover's nitrogen fixation for the difference. The corn had not noticed. 141 bushels on 100 pounds of nitrogen versus 136 bushels on 160 pounds of nitrogen. The input cost difference was $18.40 per acre. On 80 acres, that was $1,472 in savings. Dale looked at that number in the green ledger book for a while. Then he looked at Claire's spiral notebook. Then he said, "You want to do the whole farm?" "Yes," she said. "All 400 acres." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Let me think about it," he said. He thought about it for 2 days. On the third day, he came in from the machine shed and said, "You decide the rotation, all 400 acres. You tell me what you need." Let me tell you about the summer of 1988, because the whole country was about to make Claire Halverson's argument for her in a way that no notebook or soil test ever could. The drought of 1988 was the worst agricultural drought in the continental United States since the Dust Bowl. It began in the spring with below-normal rainfall across the entire Midwest and escalated through June and July into a full-scale crisis. The jet stream locked into a pattern that pushed moisture north and east, and the Corn Belt baked. By mid-July, the USDA was projecting a corn crop 31% below the previous year's average. The price of corn at the Chicago Board of Trade climbed above $3.50 per bushel for the first time in years, which would have been good news for farmers who had corn to sell, but most of them didn't. Most of them were watching their fields turn from green to yellow to the pale, papery tan of a crop that has run out of water and given up. In Pottawatomie County, the situation was the same as everywhere else. The corn that had been planted into conventionally managed ground, plowed, fertilized, no cover crop residue, low organic matter, ran out of subsoil moisture by the third week of July. Gerald Stokes drove his territory that summer and watched field after field show drought stress, the leaves rolling tight in the afternoon heat, the silks browning before pollination was complete. He had seen dry years before. This was not a dry year. This was a catastrophe. The Halverson Farm's back 80, the ground that had now had 2 years of red clover interseeding, was doing something different. It was not doing well. Let me be clear about that. 1988 was not a good year for anyone in western Iowa, but the clover ground was doing differently. The water infiltration rate that Claire had been measuring, 2.3 inches per hour versus 0.9, meant that every rain event, however small, was being captured and held rather than running off. The organic matter that had climbed from 2.7 to 3.4% on the back 80 was holding that captured moisture in the root zone instead of letting it evaporate. The mycorrhizal networks that Dr. Voss had described, the fungal threads connecting root to root through the soil, were extending the corn's effective reach for water by a factor that Claire's infiltration logs could not fully capture, but that the plants themselves were demonstrating in real time. The back 80 came in at 98 bushels per acre in the fall of 1988. The rest of Pottawatomie County averaged 61. Dale's remaining ground, which had only had 1 year of the cover crop program, came in at 79 bushels per acre. Still above county average, still demonstrably better than the conventional fields around it. But the back 80, 2 years of clover, 2 years of reduced tillage, 2 years of organic matter accumulation, had outperformed the county average by 37 bushels per acre in the worst drought in 50 years. Claire wrote all of this in the notebook. She did the math on a separate page. At $3.55 per bushel, the fall 1988 price, the back 80 had generated $347.90 per acre. The county average ground at 61 bushels had generated $216.55 per acre. The difference was $131.35 per acre. On 80 acres, that was $10,508, in a year when half the farmers in Pottawatomie County were calling their bankers. Dale looked at those numbers for a long time. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his green ledger book open in front of him and Claire's notebook open beside it, and the two books sat there side by side, and he did not say anything for what felt like several minutes. Then he said, "You were right." He did not say it loudly. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a while and has finally decided to commit to out loud. He closed the ledger book and he said, "You were right, and I should have listened to you 2 years ago instead of giving you the back 40 like it was a consolation prize." Claire said, "The back 40 is why we have the data." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean." Ruth was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and she did not say anything, but she was smiling. Let me tell you about the November afternoon when Gerald Stokes drove down the county road and turned into the Halverson driveway, because it is the moment this story has been building toward since that Saturday morning at the co-op. He came in his truck, a white Ford F250 with the Pioneer Seed logo on the door, and he parked in the gravel and got out and found Claire in the machine shed doing a post-harvest equipment check on the planter. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and he had the look of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and is not entirely confident in the rehearsal. "Claire," he said, "you got a minute?" She looked up from the planter. "Sure, Gerald." He came in and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the equipment and then at the floor. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about your yields, about what your ground did this summer compared to everybody else's." "What have you been hearing?" "That your background did 98 bushels, that the county averaged 61. "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got some customers," he said, "who are asking me what they should do different after this summer. And I don't." He stopped. He tried again. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about what you're doing with the clover, how it works, what the numbers look like." Claire set down her wrench. She looked at Gerald Stokes for a moment, and then she said something that she had not planned to say. Something that came out of 2 years of driving past the co-op and hearing the echoes of that Saturday morning laugh. "Gerald," she said, "do you remember what you said to me in May of 1987, when you saw the clover seed in my truck?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I remember," he said. "You said, 'Honey, this isn't a pasture.' You said Iowa State was teaching kids to grow hay in corn country." She said it without anger, the way you state a fact. "I was 18 years old and I had a bag of seed that cost $14, and you laughed at me in front of half the farmers in the county." Gerald looked at the floor. "I know," he said. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel bad," she said. "I'm telling you that because the lesson isn't that clover is magic. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing and manages its soil only one way is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. And 1988 was that disaster for a lot of people in this county. And it didn't have to be." She picked up her wrench again. "I'll write up what I know and get it to you. Bring your customers out here in the spring and I'll walk them through it." Gerald nodded. He said, "I appreciate that." He stood there a moment longer, like there was something else he wanted to say, and then he put his hat back on and walked out to his truck. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in November of 1988. By 1991, 14 farms in Pottawatomie County had adopted some version of the cover crop interseeding system that Claire had developed on the Halverson ground. By 1993, that number was 31. The yields were not identical to what Claire had achieved, Cover cropping is not a formula, it is a practice, and it requires attention and adjustment, and the willingness to observe what the soil is doing and respond to it. But the trend was consistent. Organic matter was climbing, input costs were falling, water infiltration rates were improving. In dry years, the farms with established cover crop programs were outperforming their neighbors by margins that were no longer possible to attribute to luck or good ground. Claire finished her degree at Iowa State in 1991. Dr. Voss wrote her a letter of recommendation that described her as the most practically applied student he had taught in 20 years. She came home to the Halverson farm, and she took over the management of the operation, and she expanded the cover crop system to include winter rye and hairy vetch, in addition to red clover, rotating them by field and by soil type, according to a plan she had developed in consultation with the Extension Office and a graduate student at Iowa State who was writing a thesis on biological nitrogen cycling in the Corn Belt. In 1994, she was invited to speak at the Iowa Agronomy Conference in Des Moines. She was 25 years old, and she stood at a podium in a room with 400 farmers and extension agents and seed dealers, and she presented 7 years of yield data and soil test results from the Halverson farm, and she explained the biology the way Dr. Voss had explained it to her, and she said, at the end of it, what she had said to Gerald Stokes in the machine shed, that any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail, and that diversification is not a strategy, it is survival, and that the soil itself will tell you what it needs if you learn to listen to it. Dale Halverson was in the third row. When she finished, he stood up. He was not the kind of man who stood up at things. The people around him looked at him, and then a few of them stood up, and then most of the room was standing, and Claire looked out at her father standing in the third row with his arms at his sides, not clapping dramatically, just standing, and she understood what that meant. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it is the part of this story that matters most. In the spring of 2003, Claire's daughter, Anna, was 16 years old and had been helping on the farm since she could walk. Anna had grown up with the cover crop system the way her grandfather had grown up with anhydrous ammonia. It was simply what the Halverson farm did, the way the Missouri River ran east, not a decision but a fact. And in the spring of 2003, Anna came to her mother with a printout from an article she had found in a sustainable agriculture journal about a farmer in Kansas who was running a mixed livestock and cash crop operation using managed rotational grazing to build soil organic matter, integrating cattle into the corn and soybean rotation in a way that was producing results that made Claire's Clover trials look like a first draft. Anna put the printout on the kitchen table and said, "I want to try something." Claire looked at the printout. She looked at her daughter, and, without pausing, without saying she needed to think about it, without offering the back 40 as a consolation prize, she said, "How many acres do you need?" That is what the notebook was for, not just to record what worked, to remember what it felt like when nobody believed it would. The Halverson farm is still there, south of the Mosquito Creek watershed, 400 acres of black Iowa ground that has been in the same family for more than 100 years. The organic matter in those fields is now above 4% in most areas, a number that soil scientists describe as exceptional for continuous row crop ground in the Corn Belt. The anhydrous ammonia applications that Dale Halverson was making at 160 pounds per acre in 1987 have been reduced to an average of 60 pounds per acre across the operation. The water infiltration rates that Claire first measured with a coffee can and a stopwatch are now documented in a formal soil health assessment that the local NRCS office uses as a reference case for farmers in the county. Gerald Stokes retired in 1998. He came to the Halverson farm one last time before he left, and he stood in the field road at the edge of the back 40, the original back 40, where all of it had started, and he looked at the soil and he said, "I should have listened to you sooner." Claire told him that the farmers he had sent to her in 1989 and 1990 had learned it in time for the dry years of the early 90s, and that was what mattered. He seemed to find some comfort in that. The spiral-bound notebook with the black and white speckled cover is in the kitchen drawer next to Dale's green ledger book. Both of them are full. She planted clover in a corn county. They laughed. The drought came. The corn died. The clover ground lived.